Okay, well, let's get started in the interest of time for everybody. Welcome, everyone. Please type in the chat box if you can hear me so I can make sure we're good. Yes, yes, yes. Okay, good. So my name is Della Hall. Hello, everybody. I am the Executive Director of Museums Alaska, and thank you all for being here and registering for our second webinar. This is a 4-part series webinar that is thanks to a grant that we received from the Alaska State Museum Grant and Aid Program. And we are also partnering with the Western Museums Association to put these on. So thank you to both of those organizations. If you're interested in the future webinars, you can find those on our website. The registration is not open yet, but there will be one in April and one in May. Let's see. Anne, I'm going to take the screen away from you.
Oh, yeah.
How do I do that? I don't know how to do that. Stop participant sharing. There we go. And then I'm going to share a screen. There we go. Is it sharing? Uh-oh, it's just a black screen.
Hey.
There we go. Okay. Is that better? So this is the basic digital photography for objects webinar. And there's my little thank you I just said. And the upcoming webinars, one in May, which is storage and mounts with Nicole Peters, and one in June, which is on sculpture and artifact care with Ellen Carley. So there's the link if you would like more information about those. And for today's webinar, some of you have already found the chat feature when I asked you to tell me if you could hear me talking. Please use the chat feature to ask questions, and I will monitor the questions and make sure that we stop a few times and make sure your questions get answered to the best of our ability. Afterwards, you will receive an email from me with attachments. You'll get a recording of this webinar, a couple of attachments that Anne has provided, and she'll refer to those, I think, throughout this webinar, and also a survey just to check how we're doing so we can report to our grantor about the success of this program. So please respond to that survey. I now have the pleasure of introducing our speaker. Today we'll be hearing from Anne Stegma. Anne is new to our Alaska Museum community. She came to Alaska in August last year, so she hasn't yet gotten to see the beautiful, amazing summer, but she will soon. And I'm going to let her introduce herself professionally, but we are all very lucky to have her here with us today. And thank you, Anne, for being here. I'll let you take over.
Oh, thank you very much. Okay. Great. Hi, everybody. Thank you, Dalla, for inviting me to speak, and I'm very grateful to Museums Alaska for asking me to talk about photography for objects. As Della mentioned, I just moved up here from New York City in August, so I'm still discovering everything and learning a lot, and everyone has just been so kind and generous with their time and knowledge. So I really appreciate all of you also coming out today. I know that there's a lot more pressing issues probably on all of our minds, but I really am thankful for you taking the time to talk about object photography with me. And so the museums I worked at in the past, I have kind of been the sole collections person, as well as working at a bigger, a more medium-sized museum. So I try to be very cognizant of knowing that not everyone has a big budget. And so I hope today that we can kind of talk about things. If you do have a budget, that's great. But if you're the only person caring for a large collection, I'm right there with you. And we can find out hopefully some things that'll help you out. And also, I was wondering if everyone could just introduce themselves and their institution or where they're from in the chat, because again, I'm new, so I don't know everybody yet. I just wanted to get a sense of where everybody is. So that'd be helpful. If you can all find the chat, I think it should be on the bottom or at the top of your screen, if you haven't found it yet. Hi, Randy. Hi, Amanda. Hi.
And if you click the little drop down menu, you can change it whether you're talking to just the panelists or the panelists and attendees. So if you would like, I think the default is just to panelists. So.
Oh, that's great. Okay, so there's a lot of folks from Alaska and then Santa Cruz. That's a long way. So great. And I also have to thank one of my colleagues I worked at my last institution. Is named Becky Batchelor. And if you have been to AAM, she did a really excellent presentation on similar, it was also on object photography. And I learned so much from her. So I'm very much standing on her shoulders as I talk today. I wanted to thank her. Oh, hi, Bethany. Oh, okay. Hi, Megan. All right. So to start off, today we're going to be learning about kind of A to Z of what it is to take a photograph of an object. So we're going to be talking about some of the equipment you might use, the camera and the settings. Focus a lot on those because I found them to be very intimidating when I first started out. The setups that you might use, and then also some post-production elements. And so why do we take photographs of objects? So I kind of narrowed it into these two categories, but I'm sure you can think of more. So we have the internal collections reasons for cataloging, condition reports, if there's an incident, documentary issues, and then we have the public facing parts of our collection, so things that get used for education, marketing, exhibition. And so I'm hopefully going to we're going to learn about taking photographs that fit in the middle of that Venn diagram. So they will be photographs that will be useful for your database and for cataloging, but that we can also give to our education friends so that they can use them for programming. And I hope that this will save you some time so that you don't have to, I know I have had to go back often and retake photographs of things when someone is like, this doesn't look pretty enough. And also it'll minimize the handling of your objects so that they will live long, happy lives. So that's kind of the goal here. And I was wondering, we can have our first quiz question, or I guess a survey question. It's not a quiz. I was wondering about how often are you photographing? How many photographs do you take in, say, a month? So yeah, there we go.
So I'll keep the poll open for about 30 seconds to give you a chance to respond. Ten more seconds. Everybody has responded. Thank you. Okay.
Oh, thanks, guys. So prompt. Okay, that's good to know. That's a fair amount, I think. Great. Okay. There we go. So first up is equipment. So some of the equipment you probably would like to have to take a photograph are surface to do it on, a tripod or copy stand or some kind of stabilizing force. It might be yourself. Backgrounds, lights, and other accessories. So we're going to go through these one at a time. So as you can see here, I have a bunch of different surfaces. If you have other ones that you use that might be good, please mention it in the chat so we can all learn. But here I just took some photos of some examples. So I was using a cart at one point. We don't, again, I'm new to the Anchorage Museum, so I'm still learning about all the new toys my new home has. And so there's not a dedicated photo space, and I think a lot of people might be dealing with that as well. So sometimes you do have a dedicated photo space, so that's great. But I was kind of practicing different methods I could use in case I needed them. So I had a cart. Table's great if you have a spare one. So there's a table there with a copy stand. The floor is good for oversized objects if you don't have a table big enough. And then I haven't used an easel a ton yet, but we have one at Anchorage, so I'm excited to use it. And that's great for more two-dimensional objects. And unfortunately, with all the prep we were doing last week, I didn't get a chance to take any examples with the easel, so I apologize for that. But those are just some surfaces. Equipment, tripods, and copy stands. Copy stands and tripods are really good for taking, standardizing your photos. You can make sure that everything is really centered, really square, and that's very helpful. So I have some examples here of the different types of copy stands and tripods that Anchorage Museum has, which is quite a lot, which is was pretty exciting for me to learn as I joined there. So there's this gigantic one, which I really like. It's good for big objects, obviously, but it also has this arm here, which can be helpful for bigger objects to make sure that you're over it while providing minimum shadows over the objects. Because if you're leaning over something, you can sometimes see the shadow of yourself, which is okay, but it's nice to try and minimize that if you can. So I really like the arm on this one, and I would like to get some arms for maybe the smaller ones. But this one is very nice. It has some levels here in the, I think, can you all see my pointer? I think so. I hope so. Thank you. And, oh, it disappeared though. Anyway, so there's levels in there. So you don't have to keep adjusting the legs, which is really nice. And there's a crank that moves the camera up and down. There we go. And then this is a smaller one, and it's, I think, like $20 or so on Amazon. So if you're working on a budget, $20 isn't hopefully too much. And because it is very nice to have a tripod for the side views of objects, and copy stands are for the overhead views. And then there's this teeny little tabletop one that my colleague lent me that is great for very small things. It works pretty much only well with a small camera. For the DSLR, it kind of shifts all over the place. But I just wanted to illustrate the size of different types of tripods. And then up here is a tabletop copy stand for smaller objects. The objects for that, its size kind of maxes out at maybe a foot, and they have to be fairly shallow things. So if you have, they're great for like pins and pens. I've been doing a lot of photography of those lately, and like so smaller things for the tabletop copy stand, but they're really great. Yeah, that's all I have for that. Backgrounds are important. I think they really make your photographs they provide a level of uniformity to them, which is really nice, and it just makes them seem really professional and fancy and nice. And it doesn't have to be that crazy. It can just be a piece of paper like I have here. When you're looking at backgrounds, I think we've all kind of seen like the pipe and drape with the fabric there. You want to consider the color and the material. So you want to choose a neutral color, so white, black, or gray. And you also want to consider how light will interact with those. So black is going to absorb a lot of light. White is going to be more reflective, which is a property I took for granted that we will get to later in this webinar. And then gray is just kind of neutral, obviously. And at my last institution, we had the kind of pipe and drape setting. We had gotten it with like a package with our camera or something. And we tried using it, and it was a little difficult for us because the fabric kept getting dirty. We were also photographing a lot of kind of industrial things that are just rusty and greasy by nature. And so it would get wrinkly, it would get dirty, and it didn't make our photos look better. We would have to keep like steaming it and stuff, and it seemed a little labor intensive for us. But it is very sustainable because you don't have to keep buying it. We ended up going with a roll of white paper, and that worked out pretty well because every time it got dirty, we could just tear off a new piece. And it was also we were able to make it very big or very small, depending on what we were photographing. So it made it a little easier for us to work with. And then this tent over here, this white tent, is really great for reflective things, which we'll talk about a bit later as well. But you can kind of put lights on either side, and that diffuses them. It minimizes the reflection. It kind of creates a standard background. And then you can also get like giant ones that you could fit a person in. This is just for very small things. But those are just things to consider when considering a backdrop. I've also been using a lot of magnets, I've noticed, to hang up my paper. And so, yeah, paper is not sustainable. And we also noticed it also was a bit more cost effective for us to get white paper versus gray paper. I know the museum standard is that gray. So it was nice to have that when I came to my new home. But it's whatever your budget will allow. You can make work either way. And if people have had success with the pipe and drape, I would love to hear about it because I think we were just doing it wrong. But anyway, the paper is really great. And whatever you have to work with, you can make it work. Lights, can't have photographs without lights. So I just threw up a couple examples here. You can have the flash from your own camera, although I wouldn't really recommend that you use it for reasons we'll get to later. You can have kind of these box lights. So there's fluorescent lights in there and the fabric over the top kind of diffuses them. Or I think we've all kind of seen this umbrella light type situation that also diffuses them. But you can also, like I've taken perfectly fine photos with just the overhead fluorescent lights. So whatever type of light you're working with, you can make it work. There's also a lot of conversation about strobe versus continuous light. So continuous light is like these box lights here. You turn it on and it stays on and you know what you're getting, and that's kind of it. Strobe light is more like a flash. You can buy kind of sensors that attach the lights in your camera, and that will send a signal to the lights to flash at the exact right moment for when you press, when you take the picture. And there used to be a lot of thought that you could only take good photographs with the strobe light, but technology is kind of advanced to eliminate some of those issues. So strobe lights are best if you were photographing something that's moving, so like a dancer, something like that, because you need kind of, it helps with the focus. And we'll talk about all these, all the things that make up a good photograph in a little bit. But our objects luckily aren't moving, or hopefully they're not. And the other issue that was with continuous light was that it could sometimes make your photo a little bit grainy, but technology is kind of advanced to counteract that. So if you're using continuous light, or even just the overhead lights that is also continuous, that's fine. There's a lot of ways that you can get around those issues. So I know the internet will fight about those things, but whatever you have is great. Okay. So these are just some of the accessories you might have. So like I said, magnets have really been helping me out lately because there are a lot of metal surfaces or bookshelves or cabinets, I think, in our collections areas that you can attach them to if you don't have a fixed space. If your object's a bit roly-poly, you want to have some weights or some supports to hold it in place. I always, with the lights, I keep forgetting to bring an extension cord, so I took a photo of that. The low tack or blue tape I've been using you can use it to hold up the color cards there, and all of you will be getting the this card here, the black, gray, and white balancing card, and we'll learn how to use it later in the webinar. And then step stool might also be helpful if you need it. So these are just things that I really have started keeping in a bag so I don't have to keep going all over storage to find them every time I want to take a photo somewhere. So now we're going to talk about cameras, and I was wondering if you could all share what type of camera you are using with your collection. That was one of the survey questions. Oh, thanks. That works too. Okay, that's great. DSLR folks, I hope I don't bore you because a lot of it is on the settings for that. Great. And there's a lot of, the reason I bring this up is there's a lot of settings on the DSLR that you can also find how to use on either your point and shoot or your camera phone. And I'm going to be using, we have the Canon Rebel there, so I'm going to be using that as kind of my starting point, but whatever camera you're using, we can find a way to help you find the settings that you'll need to find. So that's really good to know. Okay, great. So with cameras, we're going to talk a bit about lenses, and then we're going to go through kind of the manual settings and what they mean for your photograph, um, and, um, and how to use them. So first, we're going to talk a bit about lenses. There are a lot of different types of lenses, and they can get really expensive too. So I kind of just shared a few of them, and lenses are measured by how many millimeters the barrel is, how deep the barrel is. And so wide angle are less than 40 millimeters. Zoom is very flexible. It can go from 24 to 70. Normal or standard is 50 millimeters, and it's called that because that was the range that they thought the human eye could capture. And prime lenses, and those are all fixed, so they don't zoom, so you have to physically adjust yourself to use them. There are macro lenses for very, very small things, and then telephoto is enormous, and we're not really going to talk about it because our objects are all very close to us, so we don't need to photograph them on a tree somewhere far away. So for normal, you might want to use a normal or standard or prime lens because they create a little bit more clear photographs just because they don't have all the moving parts of a zoom lens. They only have that one lens. So there's less kind of machinery and glass for the light to go through. Wide angle is if you're photographing a lot of big things and you don't have a lot of space. I kind of provided an example here. This was just I was on vacation and I bought kind of a clip-on wide angle lens for my phone. And so you can kind of see on the lower photo there, you can see a lot more in the same space. There's a lot more going on. It captures more of what you're trying to see. But you can also see there's a fair amount of lens distortion on the side, which is why I ended up not using that for most of the trip. But you can see in the top photo, that was just my regular phone, and it captures a lot less information. But every lens has a bit of distortion, and so you notice with the wide angle lens, there's quite a bit on the sides. It also wasn't, to be fair, a really good lens. And so that is, if you're photographing a lot of big things, you might want to use that. And then zoom is more flexible, so that's why I kind of put the star there, because you only have to buy one, or you only have the budget to buy one. That's kind of what I would go with, just because it is so versatile. But if you're photographing a lot of objects that are the same size, your collection's all pretty much one size, which I don't think exists, but it might. Maybe normal or standard might be more useful. Macro also can be really helpful if you're photographing a lot of small things. It's physically different so that a lot of lenses kind of bow out in the center. Macro is more flat, so you lose that, and it allows you to take really detailed photos of very small things. So for museum photography, if you're photographing a lot of big things, the wide angle is useful, and the macro is very useful for small things. But if you don't have a big budget, you might just want to select one. But if you have a bigger budget, go hog wild. It's great. Okay. So next, I'm going to talk about the exposure triangle. So this was a very nice graphic that I found, and this website is in your resource packet. Every time I was a little confused or needed help in explaining something, this website keeps coming up, and it's really accessible, like technical to English kind of definitions of everything. And so aperture, shutter speed, and ISO all relate to each other. We're going to talk about them all, but this was just a really nice graphic that kind of explained what changing one, they're called kind of sliders, and so changing one affects the other. And so this was just a nice little graphic that kind of showed how that happened. So we're first going to talk about, oh, come on now, shutter speed. So shutter speed is the amount of time that the shutter stays open. It controls the amount of light that's able to hit your camera sensor or the film. And we are going to be just talking about digital photography today. Unfortunately, I missed the boat on film photography, but there are a lot of holdovers in terms. And also, might keep going back to this analogy about your eye. If you're thinking of your camera, like you think of your eye, the shutter is your eyelid, so it controls the amount of light that's able to get in there. So on your display or on your camera, The shutter speed is represented as a fraction of a second. So you'll see here that this is what the fraction is. And you can click in and it'll give you slow as a second on this camera. On yours, it might be a wider range. And oh, 1 second, I lost the chat. For the person who's using their camera phone, could you let me know if you're using an iPhone or an Android? Because that might help later too. Huh. It's okay. We'll get there. So anyway, that's what the shutter speed controls, and it's the, oh, thank you, great. So it controls, it's represented a fraction of a second. Okay, so this is how I kind of took a range of photographs to show you how it affects your photography depending just your shutter speed. Everything else is the same. And so a fifth of a second is kind of long. So you can see here it allows in a lot of light and it really bleaches out your photograph. And a thousandth of a second is really short. So the light doesn't have enough time to get into the camera before the shutter closes. So your photo's a little dark. And these were all under just general lighting. There wasn't any special lighting involved with these. So also depending on your lighting and the speed of your lighting, that may change, but just under general lighting, I found that 125th of a second was a good starting point for how I wanted to photograph my object. So if you're photographing stars at night, the long shutter speed is what you want to use. If you're like photographing a football game on broad daylight like today, hopefully where you are, you know, you might want to use a quicker shutter speed because things can get blurry if people are moving everywhere. But for objects that are very happy and close to us and not moving at all, the 125th seemed to work well for me, but it certainly involves a little bit, all of this involves a little playing around with it. Oh, come on. There we go. Okay, so next up is aperture. So aperture controls the amount of light which enters your camera and kind of relates to the focus, how it focuses on what you're trying to photograph. So if your shutter speed is the lid, your iris is the aperture. And it's represented in your camera here with f-stop. And so you can click onto there and you can find focusing on things that are small in the foreground are a lower f-stop number than large or landscape type photography, which you want a large depth of field because you want everything to be in focus. Whereas if you're just photographing something small in the foreground, you just want that to be in focus. So based on that, having a smaller f-stop is better for museum photography because we're very close to our objects. And we don't need the background to be spectacularly in detail because we're not photographing that. So you can kind of see here as you go, it gets progressively darker, which is not helpful. So if you can use a low f-stop setting for your object photography. Now we're going to move into ISO, which is the third part of the triangle. It stands for International Standards Organization, which is not a great name for an organization, but it was developed with film photography, and they kind of assigned they developed a systematic way to number how sensitive film was, which has now been transferred to camera sensors and the digital age. So you'll see this a lot, and it kind of measures the sensitivity, yes, of the camera sensor, sorry about that. So you'll see it represented as ISO here, and you click in, there's a range. I'm sure your cameras and things have ranges. And so generally a lower ISO is better because it cuts down on the noise and the graininess. However, in your ISO, I think its main job is receiving light and being sensitive to light, so it is the most affected, I think, by your light source. So when I was working with just the overhead lights, continuous light in storage, this is how it turned out. So depending on what type of setup and lights you're working with, that's going to change. That's why this one doesn't have a recommendation. It's whatever works best for you. And also technology is catching up with the ISO graininess issue. So it's not maybe as terrible as it used to be. But yeah, I found that 3200 or 6400 worked pretty well with my camera. Okay, so there's also, you can white balance. We're gonna keep coming back to white balancing because color fastness is really important for the work that we do. We wanna make sure that we're accurately representing our objects. And so some phones have a white balance internally. I know that I was asking about your phone because I have an Android and I know how this works a little bit better. But I'm sure there's some applications and things I can send to you that will give you these features on your iPhone camera as well if they're not there already. I got to play around with some of my coworkers, very nice. Let me play around with their iPhone cameras. And I can't quite remember all the features that they involved, so we'll talk. But on your point and shoot or your DSLR, there are definitely white balance settings. You can see here there's auto white balance, there's a sunny day, there's indoors, there's cloudy. But for museum lighting, you're generally going to find tungsten or white fluorescent lighting. If you purchase those exterior lights, that's generally the type of light that they have. And so you can set your camera to account for that so that it counteracts the color. And so I think the best way to illustrate this was these photos. So you can see the tungsten is a little bit, this is the Kelvin temperature, so it's a little bit cooler, so it's a little bit blue. The white fluorescent there is a little bit warmer, 7,000 Kelvin, so it's a little bit warmer photography-wise. And then I just took one with the auto white balance to see what it would do, and that's what it did. So it's nice to take a photograph that's kind of the best, the least, so you'll have to do the least editing in post-production, but if your photographs do turn out a little warm or something like that, you can always fix it later on. But it's nice to take as good a photo as you can straight off the bat. So this is what I came up with just using our regular overhead lights in storage, but it just shows you what the filters kind of do. Okay, in metering mode, this is just something kind of to confirm on your camera. You shouldn't have to change it too much. It kind of just shows where it's focusing and how it sees the light. So center weighted average is pretty good in general for object photography, and spot metering is if you want to really, really focus in on something small in the middle of your screen. So this chart, all of the camera websites I found sound like they're fake, but this one was very helpful from Digital Camera World. And I know it's a lot to read, and don't worry about that, but the center weighted average, these grids kind of best explained it to me. I guess I'm a very visual person. But you can see that the center weighted average kind of covers the most of your frame that you're working with. So that's what you want it to focus on. And then getting close to the end here, you want to select what you're going to shoot in. RAW is, if you can, it's what you should use. It does take up a lot of space. There's this really handy chart here from the Berkeley School of Journalism that kind of explained this screen to me because I didn't spend a lot of time on it myself. And so L, M, and S are large, medium, and small. You can see the resolutions here are different. And smooth is a higher quality than the blocky. You can see that they take up vastly different file sizes. Oh no, my PC is running low on battery. That's not good. And so it's best to shoot in RAW. At archival standards are TIFF, the federal guidelines for digital photo preservation are in TIFF, but a lot of cameras shoot in JPEG. So if that's what you have, that's okay. And the RAW plus L here means that it's gonna take a RAW photograph and then also a JPEG. So that RAW is great because it contains all of the details that you'll need. So there's no compression there. So for editing, that's really helpful. But then they are enormous files. So for preservation wise and just having your IT department not want to kill you, like TIFF or JPEG, TIFF is really best for the archival standard. In color section, I apologize, I didn't get a chance to take a photograph of this on my camera before we left, but there's two types of color capture that you can have. Oh, I'm so sorry. Can't see the top of my screen. Yes, color selection. So there's sRGB and there's Adobe RGB, which you might have seen as you import files for editing them or something. And so sRGB is oldest, and since it was around the longest, it was adopted by our monitors, the internet, video games. Any screen that you're looking at uses that color palette, essentially. It doesn't have as wide a range of colors. Adobe RGB is newer, but it wasn't adopted as the international standard, but it does have a bigger color range. So from what I've read, it is better to use sRGB if you're going to be using images digitally, so on your database, on social media, things like that. But if you're printing out a lot of images for researchers or to like prints to be used for an exhibit or something like that, which I don't know if you generally do from your database, but you might. And so it's better to use Adobe RGB or shoot in that for those types of images. But I know we use a lot of ours just for our database and for reports and for social media. So I think for my institution, I think sRGB might be better, but for yours, it might be the other. I'm just gonna check for a second that my computer doesn't die in the middle of this. Sorry about this, 1 second.
That's okay. Let's let Anne plug in her computer. That's a great idea. And anybody else who needs to do that, please do that. And if anybody has questions, please use the chat bar. If you kind of scroll down with your mouse, move your mouse down to the bottom of the screen, a little chat bubble pops up and you can click on that and it'll pop up with a panel. You can type any questions you have, comments, anything you want Anne to address now or maybe offline if you have a very specific question, and she can follow up with you.
Okay, I'm so sorry. I think that worked. I haven't used this laptop before this week, so we're still getting to know each other, and I think the cable is a little faulty.
Okay.
So I apologize. Okay, so button reviews for point and shoot and smartphone. I'm sure you'll be able to find these settings, or at least most of them, on your point and shoot and your smartphone. So here's our point and shoot that we have, and you can see the ISO wheels kind of here. You can see 200, 400, 600, etc. You can see that there's manual settings as well as some others. I sent out a little, or you'll be receiving a little worksheet that explains kind of what all of these, other than the manual settings, what all those other things mean, because I didn't know for a while and I thought it might be helpful. So if you don't know what they mean, don't worry. And it might be a good way to also introduce you, if you don't want to use all the manual settings at once, to just use some. You can just adapt the shutter speed and everything else is automatic. It does really help to move away from the automatic settings, but whatever's going to get you comfortable in using your camera, you should definitely go for. And then I have an Android phone, and so that's why I was asking about the smartphone, and I found this Pro mode, which is essentially the manual mode. And you can see here, I have the ISO, I have the aperture, excuse me, I have white balance. There's manual focus, which makes more sense for a phone. So you can set a lot of the manual settings there, and there are some apps you can download that are either free or $1 for iPhones that will give you similar controls if you don't have them already on your phone. I didn't talk a lot about manual focus versus autofocus. That's just because I generally use autofocus. Manual focus is good if you're photographing something that's moving, or if something is obstructed, like you have a tree in front of a house and you want a photo of the house but not the tree. Or if you're photographing something through plexiglass, which I'm sure we all do a fair amount. So that might be a situation where you want to your manual focus. But other than that, for if you have the object with you and there's nothing obstructing it, you should be able to be pretty okay with the autofocus there. Okay, so we're gonna move on to setups. I know I talk very fast. I'm really trying to slow myself down. Oh, thanks. Past Perfect cataloging. I don't know, I haven't used Past Perfect myself, but I know for TMS, it points to the photograph rather than importing the whole photograph into the system. I'm not sure if Past Perfect does the same. So hopefully it shouldn't affect your system, but I'm not sure, but I can look it up. Oops. But that might be a situation too where you want to have the TIFF file as the master copy, but maybe you want to use the JPEG, which is a smaller, like the smaller working version, as that links to your database, so it doesn't slow it down maybe dramatically. Does anyone else have any? Oh, okay. Then that should be okay. But do you, if I can also find out which, like I guess, resolution size of the image might be the best, if that helps. So does anyone else have any other questions for me? I know I also have a question for all of you, which is, I was curious if you have like a usual setup that you use for your photography, or if it's kind of ad hoc as you go. Both are fine. And maybe if in the comments you could describe them. I was kind of hoping before we all got hunkered down, if you could send me a photo of your space and we could all share them together, but I realized that that's not possible because hopefully most of us are at home.
Okay, we'll give it just a couple more seconds for anybody last answerers. All right.
Oh, great. Okay, that's about what I expected. So yeah, I'm really impressed and jealous of the people who have a regular photo set up. And if you don't, that's okay too. So thanks for sharing that. So we are going to move up to, now we have our camera all set up. Oh, sorry. Oh, great.
Somebody had a question about how you direct your questions in the chat. If you click on the chat, there's a little drop-down menu that will allow you to either direct your question to just the panelists, so just me and Anne, or to everybody so that the attendees can see your questions. So if you want other people to see your questions, then or your responses, then make sure you adjust that drop-down menu.
Okay, thanks, Haley. That's helpful to know. So yeah, we have our camera now all set up. It's ready to take photographs. And so we're going to talk a little bit about everything else around that. So this is one setup I had this last week at work. As you can see, I discovered that we have lights, which is very exciting. So I have two, they're white fluorescent lights, as I learned later, at a 45-degree angle, and the camera in the center and the object also in the center. I also kind of made a makeshift backdrop there. It's just a piece of gray paper, use any kind of paper you have, and some scrap glue board and some scrap twill tape, and I used magnets to hold the paper to the scrap glue board, and then I kind of just hung it on top of the copy stand. So the copy stand's really serving as just a background in this point. I'm not using it for its actual purpose, but it got the job done. This was another example. So this was using the copy stand on the bigger table that we have. So I have my weights there, I have the object, and I have the camera into the copy stand. And I also kind of am using that piece of white foam core as a reflector, which we'll talk a little bit about later. But again, nothing fancy here. It's just paper and foam core. Oh, okay. Oh, okay. Sorry, everybody. Okay, this is another example. If you have something really big, you can lay it down on the floor with if you need some ethafoam, and make sure you put your backdrop on top of that and kind of lay it down. I have that huge copy stand that goes there. You can also probably tell I couldn't move this copy stand around a lot because there are a lot of pipes in our ceiling and the ceiling gets very short. So it had to stay here in this little area. I have lights there as well. But it's really good for big objects because you can get a lot of height that way. And then last not least, I have my little cart set up that I did the other day. And again, that's just magnets right to a Delta cabinet. And I kind of wanted to show you the troubleshooting I did when photographing on a cart, if this is the kind of, I figured this was the smallest setup you might have. I was very lucky to have the tripod there though. So first, this is what it looked like on the cart. You can see that the object's really small. It's not taking up the frame at all. And it's also, its foot's cut off. It's kind of a mess. And you can see more of the background than I would like. So I was trying to think of how to fix that. And so I took a box and I put it under the table. And so that kind of raised it up to the center, which is where I wanted it to be. I was pretty happy with that, but you can still see too much of the outside. So I repositioned my tripod. Its legs kind of weren't in the right place to start with. And that was able to get it closer so that the object is more in the center. It's still not filling in the frame as much as I would have liked, but it's certainly an improvement from the first one. And you can see here, kind of behind the scenes, there's the paper, there's the, there's the box and the cart, and then my camera's over here. So here again is where you would place, oops, I'm so sorry, my thing's at the top. The lights, it's a pretty standard setup. Sorry, we're moving on to lighting now. Sorry, some of the chats and things are over the headings of these. So this is a pretty standard setup. I'm sure you've seen before. We have lights at a 45-degree angle to the object. This website was really helpful. It had a lot of interesting articles, but this one was particularly about photographing art, which I was like, that's great. That's what I'm talking about. So there you see they kind of have, instead of a gray backdrop, they're using black velvet, and they're also photographing a framed object with glass. So I didn't want to get too much into that, but I did want to use this graphic just to show the angle of the lights to the object in relation to your camera. It's pretty standard for just general photography. And I also wanted to show some examples of how different lighting hits your objects in different ways. So I kind of said before, I wouldn't use the flash personally, because you can see kind of here, it gets really spotty and it kind of washes out the object. It makes it just, yeah, it washes it out. This was just with the general overhead lights, and I'm sorry that these all aren't consistent because with the map at the end. But you can see here the color is a little warm, but the color is all the same. There's not anything that's too much brighter than anything else. And then using the fancy white fluorescent lights, you can see that the colors are really vibrant, and it's all evenly lit, but it's still very bright, kind of. This is a bit more subdued. So that's kind of how they played out there. There are other situations where you might not want to have your light at 45 degrees. You might want to use raking light to kind of show texture, or if you have a sculpture that you want to show depth with, you want to place the light on the side and still have the camera in the center. And then if you have a white piece of paper or like I said, that foam core, you might want to use that to kind of bounce light in a different direction. But raking light is very useful for those types of materials, things with a lot of depth. Or there's also, I know conservators use light for a lot of different types of lights with lots of different filters, or sometimes people also put lights behind a backdrop to kind of illuminate from behind. So there's a lot of different ways you can do it. All of those things get quite costly. And so I think even if you just have one set of lights, it improves your photography a lot. But if you're just using overhead light, again, that's great. And I know for condition reporting, sometimes it can just get tricky, and it is just easier to use. Condition reporting, you're usually looking for something really specific. So whatever you need to do to get that photograph is what you need to do. So, gosh. There we go. Okay, oh, so this was my example where I was just demonstrating how I kind of used the foam cord to kind of bounce some light back at the object there from the other side, because the lighting in the ceiling was kind of spaced weirdly. And it's very subtle, but you can see that with the deflector, it's a little bit less warm. The color is a little bit truer. And without the deflector, it's a little bit warmer. And yeah, it's very subtle. I know I've been looking at these for a while, so if you're looking at them and they're like the same, it's not like night and day, but there are a little bit of differences. You can kind of tell in the shadows that are around in this area. So I just wanted to kind of show just a small example of how that works. Oh, good, thank you. I was going a bit insane this morning trying to see if they did or not. Thanks. So now we're going to talk about framing your object. Make sure that it takes up a good 3/4 of the frame is always a good rule of thumb. And because that way, if it's zoomed out like this, when you crop it, it kind of does a digital zoom, which kind of stretches out the pixels for lack of a better term. So it can get kind of pixelated and grainy. So this is too zoomed out. And this is too close. It is filling up a lot of the frame, but you do want to leave some room in case you have to edit or rotate something. You don't want to cut off the object and then have to go photograph it again. So I thought this was a pretty good compromise between those two. It is also hard for things that are long, or that, oh my goodness, that are narrow like this. And so a tip that I use is, because when you crop it, your photographs just turn out really long and rectangular. So if you kind of place things like that, or I've been photographing a lot of pens lately, I've been placing them on an angle, and when you crop this, it becomes more square. And that just provides uniformity with your other photographs that you have, that you don't kind of have like a long narrow photograph and then big blocky square one. They can all kind of stay the same shape and all that, if you're looking at them in an array, like a light box view or something like that. So, yeah. And large objects, as we kind of talked about, are tricky. In the past, I know that I've seen setups from friends at other museums where they have to photograph like giant planes and things like that. And they have like a warehouse where they can do that, but I don't think most of us have that. So for large objects, I'd recommend laying down your backdrop, and hopefully this is a very small example of this, because I apologize, a little rushed for time at the end of last week, but if you get a big piece of paper, you can lay down a parka or something like that, and it stabilizes the object and it supports it. And then you're able to just worry about taking the photo there. So you can see the lights on either side. And I have this arm that is stretched out over the object there so that it can be centered and have a good distance on each side. But if you don't have the big fancy tripod, what you can do, this is my colleague Julia, who's very nice to demonstrate this for me, is you can hold your elbows to your side, and that kind of stabilizes your hands. It gives your elbows something to rest on, that's yourself. And you can stand on a step ladder, and the lights are there, which will minimize the shadow of you leaning over the object. If you don't have the lights, then that's okay. And what you can kind of do is you can stabilize your arms against your body, your elbows against your body, and then as you take the photograph, you can kind of hold your breath, and that kind of stabilizes you. And then when you take the picture, there shouldn't be, you don't have to worry about accidental movement or anything like that, or a blurry photograph. So if that's more your speed, then that's an option that you might want to use. Yeah, and like I said, having the, even if we just had a regular tripod instead of the gigantic one, having that arm to center your photograph over bigger objects is really, really helpful. It just gives you some more options, which is helpful. So this is a mistake I made that I wanted to share with you all because I learned from it, and hopefully you can too. So when I originally put our lights together, I assumed that they were tungsten, so I put the tungsten filter, that white balance filter we talked about earlier, on my camera. And as you can see, it turned out super blue. And I was like, oh, I was so frustrated. I was like, oh, I thought this was supposed to work. And it was just the wrong filter. I looked at the box and it said white fluorescent. So I changed it. And when I changed it to white fluorescent, you can see that the colors were right and a lot more true to what they should be. And so, yeah, that was just, I learned from this mistake. And so I thought I would share it. So hopefully it will help you as well. But also you can see kind of that's how it was framed and turned out. It probably could have gone a little bit closer, but that's how it turned out. And afterwards I can rotate it and crop a bit, clean it up a little bit. Reflective optics are really tricky. And again, the setup for this is in theory correct. The examples probably could have done a bit better. But here you can see I have my table set up. I have the lights on either side, I have the camera in the center, ready to go. You can see here, I have a really shiny mug that I was trying to take a photo of. So what I've done in the past working with white paper is I cut a hole in the center of the white paper and I use a really big piece. This piece, I'm sorry, wasn't that big. And that kind of shields the object, the reflective surface, from all of the camera and everything else that's going on. It provides a really blank reflective surface for the light to bounce off of. What I neglected to remember with this is that gray paper is not as reflective as white paper. And so it definitely affects the exposure, the darkness and lightness of what you're trying to photograph. But that was something good that I learned from this, because again, using newer materials. And so anyway, in theory that works, especially when we were talking about that tent earlier with the white tent. So if I were to put the mug in the white tent, that's all very reflective and good. The lights, it would diffuse the lights, although these lights already have diffusers. And then if I had a white piece of paper, I could put that across the front, the hole in the center with just the lens through it, so just the lens would reflect, and that would help a lot. You might also want to use, maybe if you have some of that white foam core or a white piece of paper or something like that. But this was a learning experience for me because it got, here you can see from the side what it looks like, but you can also see with the end, the width is much darker because it wasn't white paper. So, but with the without, you can see there's a lot of noise and reflection and stuff there. And here you can still, again, you can see that the piece of paper wasn't quite big enough, so I apologize. But you can see it's a little bit smoother. There's less of this business going on. So that should help, I hope, with reflective objects. I know they can be really tricky. And so that's a trick that might help. So now you have your photographs and they're really good. And so we're going to talk a little bit about post-production, software, more white balancing. You can never have enough. Applications, applying the customization to other photos, and cropping in Clone Tool, which you might, I'm guessing, might be familiar with already, hopefully. So software-wise, there's Adobe Suite, which we're all familiar with, Photoshop, but that can get expensive. There are free options like GIMP, and Adobe Bridge is free. I'm going to demonstrate Bridge in a little bit just because it is free, and you can do a surprising amount with it. I hadn't used it much. At my last institution, we didn't have Photoshop. We just used GIMP, which is an open source photo editing software, and it's really similar to Photoshop. And I really like it. So if you're also editing things on your phone, which just if you're on the fly, I don't know, Snapseed is good for Android. I've used that before just in regular life. And for Mary Ellen with the iPhone, iOS uses VSCO and Afterlight, I've read, are good applications. And they will also, I think they interact with your camera app so that you can get more of those manual features too if you want them. And so they're low cost, but free or low cost, depending on which one you get. So this is Adobe Bridge. And you can see a bunch of the photographs I took for this presentation. So I chose one that was on purpose. You can see it has the tungsten filter on there. I think it's very blue. So I chose this one. And what you can do is go up to this little button, and that will open the Camera Raw application and allow you to edit your photographs. There's also, I've read that people are like, oh, you can't edit JPEGs like after the fact, and that TIFFs and RAW are definitely better for editing just because they have more details and more pixels and things, but you can definitely edit JPEGs and it turns out okay. So anyway, this is the Camera Raw application that pops up. So you can see here, so I'm going to close the chat for a second. So we have our photograph. There's this histogram here that's all over the place. We'll talk a little bit about that. This should say custom. I'm sorry, it says as shot, but or it says as shot for now, and it will say custom in a second. But you can take your little eyedropper tool here, and this is where our wonderful little card comes into play. So this white balance tool is looking for a neutral color, and so when you use this, you're telling, oh come on, mouse, come back. You're telling the computer like this is a neutral color when you select it. So it is, it knows that the color you're going to be clicking on, or it's expecting the color that you're going to be clicking on. If you click on another section, it's going to do weird things to the color as well. But it is expecting the color you're clicking on to be that color on the chart. So it is like the Pantone color, or like the scientific mathematical color that is. So that's what it's expecting to see. And so, so if you take your eyedropper tool and you click on that square, and I think we're actually going to talk about white balancing for a second. Lord. There we go. Okay. So back to this histogram. Sorry about that. To white balance, you want the RGB values here, red, green, and blue, to be the same. So if they're all the same and it's a lower number, like 82, that's generally for a more black or dark gray. The higher numbers are for white. So if all of the numbers were 233, they're all in alignment, and that's more white. But you can see here, all of these numbers are all over the shop. So this is not white balanced at the moment. But when we use our little eyedropper tool and click on the gray, this is what happens. You can see that it looks a lot more like what we were expecting. And you can see here, I think I had my mouse over the gray there, that all the color, they're much more in alignment. The red, green, and blue are much closer together, which is what we want. That means that's getting closer to being color fast. And you can see here, this is now switched to custom because we're customizing our white balance. And it changed the temperature there and the tint to make it, to make sure that this color gray is the color gray it's supposed to be. So you can see here, when you hold your mouse over the eyedropper tool over these different colors, this is what comes up. So for the black, it was around 92. For the gray, the numbers were around 130. And for the white, they were in the 238 to 30 to 40 range. So it's good that they're all really similar, but they're a little too bright for what they should be. When I was actually there photographing it, that it wasn't quite that bright. So to change that, you can go down to these sliders here, and usually you just need a little bit of the exposure. And since it was a little bright, I made it a little darker. So you can see that there. And then when I did I took my little tool and I just held it over. I didn't have to click on it again or anything. And I went to the balancing card. It was more like this. So they're all pretty close. I didn't go too insane with it, if I'm honest. I could have, but I didn't. So they were all more within the range of what I wanted them to be. So In one of the books that's in the resource packet, it's a really wonderful book put out by the Canadian government called Lighting for Museum Photography. But it covers everything. It covers a lot of what's I've talked about in this webinar, and it covers a lot of different lighting situations for different types of objects. And it's only about, it's like $40 from the Canadian government. On Amazon, it's like 70, so I wouldn't buy it there. But it's really helpful, and I think their numbers were very specific. They were like 72, 115, and 233 for the different black, gray, and white ranges. But in doing a bit more research online, and the book was published I think in 2007, 2008, so it's not that long ago, but I think maybe those numbers have changed a little bit as technology has changed. So that's why I kind of put a range here, but use your best judgment about, you know, what you remember the photograph looking like, and try and imitate or get to that here. And again, if we've gone through all the steps, like that first photograph after, I'm using on purpose a terrible photograph to show you how to do this, but hopefully you won't have to do it too much because your photographs will be so great from doing this all before. So you can see here, there's the photograph that was really heavily blue, and then this is the, the one at the end of editing. And so if you have taken a bunch of photographs under the similar light conditions, and you've white balanced one, and you have it the way you like it, you can apply those settings to the other photographs because they're all taken under the same conditions. So the same changes should apply to all of them. So just kind of a quick way of doing it. And to do that in Bridge, you select the photos you want, and then you right click on the photograph that you've changed, and go to Develop Settings and Previous Conversion. And that will apply those settings to the photographs that you've selected. And you'll see these little sliders that happen there on the top. So sometimes this is a photograph I just took just to work on this week when I knew I'd be home. But when I was editing it, I noticed it was a really good example of lens distortion. So you can kind of see here in the middle, and I apologize I don't have the credit line or the accession number for this because I didn't anticipate using it in this. But in the middle here, it kind of bows out. And so to be able to fix that, there is actually a setting in Adobe Bridge where you can go over here on this panel to lens correction, and it pulls all the metadata from the image, so it knows what type of camera you were using. You can see here it has all the settings that it knew that I was using then. So it uses that information to fix the lens distortion. And so you can also do it manually, but I just did enable profile corrections, and it kind of flattened it out there. And you can see there's also more, there's always more fiddling with it you can do. And so in this, I'm trying to strike a balance between like how insane you should get, because I know that time is very precious to everybody. So to do enough editing to make it look good, but not to take up hopefully too much of your time. But anyway, that's just, I want to show you really quick how to fix some of the lens distortion. Depending on the type of lens you use, or again, what you're photographing, you might see it more, you might see it less. And again, the lens distortion is just because of the physical way that the, I think, convexness of the lens, it's just inherent into how it works. And that's why that macro lens kind of is more flat, so it tries to minimize that distortion, but only for very small areas. Cropping this, again, I'm sorry, I don't have GIMP on this laptop. I have my desktop at work, but it's very similar. The toolbars and everything on the left there are very similar. So I was just demonstrating real quick, I'm sure we're familiar with it, the cropping tool, so you can kind of make it smaller. And also, I'm sure as you noticed, and maybe it's been driving you nuts, the card has been in the end of all of these photographs, so I was going to show you a handy way to get rid of that. There's two ways. So anyway, but I like to crop it down first because then you don't have to Photoshop as much out. So I thought that was a good crop for that. There's still a little bit of room on either side. It's not too squished. but it's still taking up a fair amount of the frame. So this is the clone tool here. It looks like a stamp. So that's what we're going to do next to get rid of this. And so the settings for that are up here. So you can make it bigger or smaller by pixel size. And you can also make it harder or softer. If you make it 100%, then you're going to really see the edges of the circle as you use it on the screen. So you want it to be a little soft so it kind of blends in, because that's what we're trying to do, is blend this away. But anyway, that's what those terms mean. So here you can see there's really helpful hints that pop up at the bottom. So you select a surface using Alt and right click that you want to copy. And then you just right click and you can kind of smudge it away. It copies the section that you selected. So just select a piece of the background that fits in with that piece of the background. And then it disappears. That's great. So that's a very complicated way of doing it. And it looks like that. Hooray! We've gotten there. But another way that you can get rid of the card scale, which is easier, is if you just shoot one photograph of an object using that color card, you apply all the settings to that one photograph. You do all the editing to that one photograph, and then you apply all those settings to the series of other photographs that you took that don't have the white card in them, which is kind of what we talked about before. So that way is easier. It might take up a lot less of your time. I just wanted to show you what you could do if you wanted to. So last but not least, file selection at this point, and LOCKSS, which stands for lots of copies, keep stuff safe. It's a really good acronym that's used in digital preservation. And I thought it would be good to share here. You know, you have your backups maybe on your work network and maybe the cloud network, or maybe an offsite place, or maybe you put your database and photographs into a hard drive and take it home. But it's just good to have multiple copies of things to make sure that all the data stays safe. If you can, try and shoot in RAW, since that has the most detail. For the federal guidelines, which I sent a link to, they have really helpful charts of like best case scenario, and like it's a scale of 5 stars. So best case scenario, worst case scenario, and what you can do in between there. So for those, try and save the master in a TIFF. And then I make a lot of working copies into JPEGs that are used for if the database is really slowing down, or if your database imports the whole file, then yeah, TIFFs are probably going to slow it down a lot. But JPEGs are really good for like education, social media, that type of stuff. If you're sending things to researchers for a book, you probably want to send them the TIFF. And as much as the master copies should be TIFF, digital files aren't always forever, so it is good to check on them every once in a while. I had a little calendar invite at my last place where every quarter we would try and check through with like 100 photographs just to open them up, make sure they weren't corrupted, put them back to bed. That's especially true for JPEGs, which I know is digital photography is very convenient, but it does create kind of this digital storage issue, which I feel like could be a whole other webinar. So yeah, I'm very happy to answer any questions, and I'm very thankful for all of you being here. If you have any questions that you just want to like chat about too, I'm around. I'm not around at this number though, but my email is there. And if you have any other questions, I'm happy to answer them. Open the chat back up. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Anne. Awesome. I learned a lot. I hope everybody else did too. And if anybody has any questions for Anne, please enter them in the chat. I think I also have the power to unmute someone if someone really wanted to ask a question verbally. We do have about 15 minutes left in our allotted time. So if somebody really wanted to do that, let me know in the chat and I will do that. But otherwise, I'll just tell you some wrap-up information, which is kind of a repeat of what I said at the beginning. So basically, I will be sending an email to you. It won't be immediately after this, but soon this afternoon, you'll get an email from me with some documents that Anne referenced and a copy of this recorded webinar and a survey that I really hope you will take. It's just a really short, I think it's only 3 to 5 questions that just asks you for your feedback about this webinar so that we can make sure, Museums Alaska can make sure that we're serving your needs and helping you grow as museum professionals. And then, oh, I forgot to mention this at the beginning. Anne mentioned a few times that grayscale color card thing. Because we did this as a grant project, we have some funding and we're going to mail you all some color cards. So when you filled out your registration, you put in your address, so I will mail it there. I realize some of you are not there, you're at home, but when you get back to your museum, there will be a color card waiting for you, maybe in a few weeks. So I think that's it. Take a look at your email and our website for the future webinars. We have 2 more coming up. And it looks like we do have a couple questions.
Oh, that's a really good one, Selena. Of course you do. That's really smart. I'm trying to think. Yeah, I think it would just involve adjusting your lighting a lot. Or maybe you could even, this isn't like very archival or anything, for preservation purposes, but like maybe if you had a tiny like camera that you could like we've used them in aircraft where you can, it's kind of on a tube and you can kind of put it into small places and you can see what you're working with. So it wouldn't be for like I don't know what type of file type that would be to preserve that digitally. But you might, I can try and find the name of that camera. That's a really interesting question. But that might work for, yeah, like seeing how things were made. Because yeah, that's a really good question. That you can't quite fit a big camera into.
Yeah, about taking the images of interior of objects. That was the question. Yeah. And then Andrew has just asked if we can share this recording with coworkers. I'll be sending the copy of it directly to each of you who have paid for this webinar. And right now, I don't have a plan to make it available for free to everyone. But you know, if your organization has paid for this, then it is yours to use in your organization. So, but please don't share it super widely, I guess.
Yeah, I'll try and find the name of that camera. I don't know if it'll do what you want it to, but it might be a fun option. So sorry, I'm just writing down your email address.
Excellent. And I can also share Anne's contact information in that follow-up email.
Yeah, similar to a medical camera.
That way people can directly contact you. Oh, Andrew said a medical camera. Yeah.
Yeah, it's similar to that. It wasn't a borometer, but it was something. And I remember it was neat for us to use on aircraft that we couldn't get, like we couldn't see like what the inside was like. So we had a tiny keyhole. We could shove this camera through that, and then we could kind of see the inner workings of the gear shaft that we were working on. And it had its own light. So I imagine if it worked for that, it would probably work for the moccasins as well. Do I establish the positions? I usually do a bit of trial and error to see where the card fits best. You want it to have light hitting it the same way that the light's hitting your object. So that's why if you're doing an overhead photo, you want to just kind of lay it next to it, which next to the object, which makes it really handy. But that's why you kind of saw it taped up in the background there in a lot of the photos, because I wanted the light to hit it the same. Whereas if it was hitting the object, whereas if I laid it down next to it, I wouldn't really be able to see it, or it might be on an angle or something. So sometimes there's a bit of back and forth depending on how big, I guess, the thing is I'm photographing, and if I'm using a tripod or using a copy stand.
I made us big again. Okay, anything else? Give you guys a couple of minutes. I know it takes a little while to type and we can't see that you're typing if you are, so.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'm sorry, everybody, if you were typing and I just moved on. I didn't know if there'd be the little bubbles. We get so used to them.
I know. Such a great feature. Randy asking about, are there resources to learn about TIFF, RAW, and JPEG size issues?
I think some of the resources I sent you will definitely cover it. The federal digitization guidelines are really long, but they definitely cover more about TIFF, RAW, and JPEG. And a lot of even just the commercial sites that I kind of sent to you all will kind of explain that a little bit. So I hope those help. And if they don't, I can try and find some more. But the federal guidelines I use a lot just for, because it's really nice, depending on the technology and time and space I've had at the moment, to be like, okay, I can scan things like at the, more for scanners, but like having things at 300 DPI, or like the different bit depths and things, which I didn't really get into here because they get a little confusing. But yeah, the federal guidelines are really good for what type of file is best for what type of use. So I checked this out, and it's free. It's a giant PDF, but it's free, like all the NPS type stuff. The white cards.
Mary Ellen was trying to clarify. She's asking about black card. Is that what? I don't know.
Oh, do you have like 3 separate? I've seen that too, where it's 3 separate cards, where it's a black, a gray, and a white one. Oh, do you mean in the, I'm so sorry. It's hard to see if you're typing it out. Or like in the lighting demonstration where you had the reflector versus not? Oh, okay, thank you. Oh, I just did trial and error. And some of them turned out better than others, yeah. If you're doing, and I guess it's where what kind of light you're using and the direction of it as well. So for like that raking light example, the light was coming in at parallel, I guess, to where you would be standing. So you put the reflector there to try and angle it towards the object. So yeah, it's a bit of trial and error. I hope that this cuts down, hopefully, on how much you have to do, but there's all a little wiggle room everywhere. So sorry.
Okay, anybody else frantically typing your questions or want to be unmuted? If you are unmuted, you will be a part of the official recording. If not, maybe you all are very hungry and want to go to lunch, because in Alaska, at least, it is almost noon. Okay. Well, if not, just send an email to one of us or both of us, and we'll try to follow up and help you as best we can. Thank you, Anne, again, and thank you, everybody, for coming to participate today. And everybody, stay healthy and stay safe, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye, everybody.